So my name is Stef, and I'm going to talk to you today about psychology, about metacognition, and about how we can leverage the way we think to make us better investigators. So, like I mentioned, I'm Stef. I recently moved to FireEye Mandiant after graduating with my degree in information technology. I have a background in clinical psych, and I did this research when I was an intern with Applied Network Defense last summer, which is why I'm here presenting. And I'm pretty outdoorsy when I'm not working, so I used to be a former whitewater raft guide. It's super fun. If you've never tried it, I highly recommend it. I want to give a shout out to Chris Sanders, my very dear friend and co-investigator who could not be here today. I'm sure that you're familiar with his work. He's the owner and operator of Applied Network Defense. He's written some excellent books, including Practical Packet Analysis, and he's also the founder of the Rural Technology Fund, which, if you're not familiar with the work of the RTF, it is a fantastic charity that works to put technology into the hands of rural students in places very much like Chris's beautiful hometown of Mayfield, Kentucky, which you can see right here. All right, so to start off, I think we have a few analysts in the room, I'm guessing. Show of hands, people who've worked in a SOC, who've worked doing some investigations. Come on, let me see them. Yes? All right, if you haven't, that's okay. We're gonna do a thought exercise. You're just gonna have to suspend your disbelief a little bit more. So let's say you're working, and for whatever reason, a process pops up on your radar. So we have this suspicious process called update.exe. Maybe you got an IDS alert, maybe you were actively threat hunting. But you're looking at this process, it's suspicious. What I want you to do now is to take a few moments and think of how you would start this investigation. So think about questions you might ask yourself or pieces of evidence that you'd like to see next. And I'm actually going to pause and give you some time to think about this. I encourage you to write down your thoughts, just jot it down very quickly, and see if you can come up with a few options for where you would start. All right, so I'm starting to see eyes popping back up looking at me. So if you haven't finished your list, that's okay. Wrap up your thoughts. I'm not going to ask you to give me your answers. But if I were to come and ask you, how did you make that list? How did you decide to begin the way you did? How did you make the choices that you made? I imagine that's a little bit of a harder question because it means you have to think about how you're thinking and why you're making the choices that you're making, which is very, very difficult to do. We interviewed a number of analysts for our research last summer, and when we asked them questions like, how did you decide how to proceed in your investigation, one of them had this to say: it's hard to put into words, and it's very hard to put into words because even if you understand a process really well, it's extremely difficult to explain step by step how to do that process. If you don't understand the process very well, it makes it that much harder. So let's talk a little bit about that process and the analyst workflow and how we tend to approach our investigations. So analysts will receive, oh goodness, all right, we're missing some text, but that's okay. So on the left, we have an alert or a piece of information. So let's say we have the update.exe process. You go through your investigation steps. It's not usually this linear. The line needs to go in some more loops. It's rarely this straightforward. And then at the end of your investigation, you have a conclusion. And when you are looking at the process just from input to output, it sounds very linear. It sounds very easy to do, but we know it's not. If it were that easy to do, it would be automated completely by now, and it's not, and it will never be, because what's really happening is a little bit more abstract. So let's think about the analyst workflow from a cognitive perspective. There we go. So on the left, we have perception. We have the idea of what the alert means to us. That's really what's happening. Because you don't know, you don't have the data yet when you receive that alert, when you have that information. You have an idea of what may have happened, and through your investigative process, you move closer to reality. That's what we do as analysts, is we're trying to figure out what the reality of the situation is. And to start with this perception that we have, because it is more abstract, it means there's a lot of different factors that go into it. If you have a perception, you can have bias. If you have a perception, the way that you think about things can change how you move to the reality of the situation. Honestly, if you haven't had enough coffee, the way you have your perception of the start of your investigation may have a big effect on how your investigation goes. So it really is beneficial to take a moment and to think about the way you're thinking about your investigations. A fancy word for thinking about thinking is metacognition. Metacognition is not something that we are typically very good at without training and without being very intentional about it. But once you can do that, once you can have your thoughts and then look at them and say, why am I thinking this? Why am I making these choices? What are my biases? You can feed that metacognition back into your regular thinking, and it's a wonderful positive feedback loop of improved cognition, better understanding, better learning, and you start to develop a better sense of why you're making the choices that you're making. Analysts are not necessarily any better at this than the general population. And one of the studies that I really love that takes a look at analyst thinking and really served as inspiration for a lot of the work that Chris and I are doing is a study done where a bunch of sociologists embedded themselves in a SOC for 15 months. They worked in the SOC, and this is the final takeaway, or what I think is the most important takeaway from their study. It's a wonderful paper. I highly recommend it, by the way. The profession is so nascent that the how-tos have not been fully realized, even by the people who have the knowledge. The process required to connect the dots is unclear even to analysts. I'm going to read the last part again. The process required to connect the dots is unclear even to analysts. This was reflected in the interviews we did with our analysts this past summer. For example, one had this to say: I can't script what I do. I can't just give a run book to somebody to go, this is what I do, because it's very much in the moment. Another analyst had this to say at the end of their interview process with us. It's interesting to think about. Usually this is a process with a lot of shortcuts where you don't necessarily have to systematically think through it. I'm used to the pathways enough that I don't question myself as much as I should. As analysts, we know how to do our jobs. We don't know how we know. We just do. We learn how to do the work by doing the work. I would bet good money that all of you at some point have heard or said the phrase, more art than science, at some point to a trainee, somebody who's learning how to do the job, or something you heard when you were first starting out. If you do just know, if you have enough experience to just know how to begin an investigation, this is not so bad. It works, obviously, it works. This is a real problem for new analysts. And when you're trying to train them, it makes it take a lot longer for them to reach their full potential. I saw another study recently that suggested it takes analysts about 12 months to reach their full productive potential in a SOC environment. That's a long time. It would be great if we could make that shorter, if we can bring people up to speed more quickly. And that's one of the main things that we wanted to try to figure out how to do with our research. So let's talk about some thinking styles. And the thinking styles that I'm going to mention today are from some of the work Chris has already done. So he has seen these patterns and has formed some theories about the kinds of thinking that analysts are already using in their investigations. One kind of thinking is divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is where you have one specific piece of information and you use that to generate a large number of ideas, which you've already done today. That's what we did with our exercise. I gave you a piece of information, the suspicious process, and you came up with a list of ideas to start with. And that's how it plays out in an investigation too. You have your input, you have the place where you start, and you sort of come up with the different ideas for how to proceed. Another piece of that coin is convergent thinking. In convergent thinking, you take a lot of different ideas and you converge, you pull them together into one best choice for the situation that you have at hand. So if you were going to use your convergent thinking skills, I would ask you to take a look at the list that you created, and you can do this if you like. Take a look at the list that you created and pick your one single best investigative choice from that list that you have. That would be using your convergent thinking skills. And in an investigation, this might look like deciding, maybe the source of a specific piece of malware, for example. As you can tell, these go together, these two pieces. You have a piece of information, you diverge, you think about your options, you converge again, and you go in this cycle. This is called the creative problem-solving process. And it's something you already do. We're putting names on it and organizing a little bit, but you already do this. And as you know, it might happen more than once, too, during an investigation. This isn't just a one and done. This might be you start an investigation with your divergent thinking skills, come up with questions, and then pick the best one to start with. Then maybe later in the investigation, you come up with potential sources and decide which one you think is most plausible. So by laying this out and by using some new terms, giving us some new vocabulary, we can start systematically understanding how analysts are thinking about their work, which is what we need to do. We need to get some insight into this process. So that's what we did. So we wanted to really lay some groundwork for the theory of how analysts approach investigations in information security. So we put out the call, we got a bunch of participants. We had 16 in total. Wide range of experience, anywhere from less than 6 months in the industry to over 20 years of experience. And in a number of roles as well. We had a lot of SOC analysts, incident responders, threat hunters. We gave them a set of quantitative assessments. So we gave them 3 tests and had them give us some information about their metacognitive awareness and about their own perceived skill level. The big piece of it was the interviews we did. So we did interviews with every one of our analysts. We gave them multiple scenarios to walk us through verbally, including the scenario that you got here today. They were given the same prompt. We transcribed all of those interviews. After we transcribed them, we went back through and looked at the material that we had and kind of scored it, in a sense, using a code book that we built. I'm not going to go into detail about the code book, but if you'd like to talk to me about it, please come grab me at some point. It was really interesting to put together. But what we did was we looked for traits and behaviors that are correlated with different kinds of thinking and different kinds of personality traits. Because we wanted to be able to see what kinds of thinking were happening during an investigation without relying on the investigators having to say things like, oh, well, I'm using my convergent thinking here, which, as we know, is really hard to do and not something that most people tend to do. And then after we completed that work, we went into the code book that we had, looked at some scores, ran some numbers, and we came up with a pattern, or we saw a pattern in the responses. And from that pattern, we were able to build a theory of how investigators approach investigating their incidents in their investigations. All right, I'm gonna drink some water. We're gonna take a deep breath. If you're not on the edge of your seats, you can get on the edge of your seats because we're going to talk about the results now, which was, I'm so excited about all of this. This is super exciting. We're gonna start really quickly with the quantitative results. So like I said, we gave our analysts an assessment so they could assess their own metacognitive awareness. And it's self-report, but it's a pre-existing scale that's already in the literature and was available for us to use. We also had them rank their own perceived skill level, and we ranked their skill levels as well, and we put them into 3 separate groups. So we have expert analysts, intermediate analysts, and beginning analysts. And when we put them into these groups and looked at their average metacognitive awareness scores, this is the trend that we found. So the numbers that you see here are the average scores for each skill group that we interviewed. As you can see, the beginning analysts believed themselves to be more metacognitively aware than the experts did. This is a good example of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which you may have heard of. It's certainly not only in information security, it's across disciplines. And it's another kind of metacognitive unawareness. It gives us sort of more insight into the fact that analysts aren't necessarily better or worse at assessing their own metacognitive awareness than the general population. All right, this is the most exciting part. I mentioned that we came up with a theory for how analysts approach their investigations, and this is our theory. This is the ambiguity-driven convergence model. I'm going to very quickly talk through it, and then we're going to go into more detail on each of these items. So analysts almost always start their investigations with their intuition. They continue to work from their intuition until they reach a specific set of circumstances, for the most part. So there'll be a situation, which I will talk about, and there will also be a kind of personality trait that gets activated around the same time these high-stakes situations occur. And that combination moves analysts away from their intuition and into more deliberate, divergent, and convergent thinking. So to talk about each of these pieces, intuition, my favorite definition for intuition is a vague perception that points work in a promising direction. It's not based on logic or fact, it's based on feelings, and it's based on previous experience. This is where the just knowing comes into play. A couple of our analysts said things like, so I would say I usually start with the first thing that comes to mind and then just table all the others. Another said, I just kind of go with my gut and, based on my experience, start looking at things. Intuition's not bad. I'm not here to demonize intuition. We need it. We need a place to start from. But there are some downsides to working out of our intuition, and we need to understand what those are so we don't kind of fall victim to it in a way. So when we were interviewing our analysts, we had them, as I mentioned, create lists very similar to the ones that you did. And then we had them use their convergent thinking, and pick their best option. And we kind of refer to those options as the high-quality investigative paths, because these are the options chosen by the analysts to be the best bang for their buck in getting their investigations started. So, of those choices that the analysts themselves made to begin the investigation, only 10%, the number that should be there is 10%. Only 10% of the items were the first choice of the analysts. So when they were going back into look at their choices, only 10% of the time did the analysts actually want to begin their investigation with the first item on their list. That's huge. That's huge. I know when I'm doing investigations, I have the first thing that pops into my head, and even doing the research, I still just kind of go off on that tear. I have my first idea, and I want to follow that because that seems to be the most plausible at the moment. Now, there we go. So 95% of the items were actually on the list, though. So when they're choosing these high-quality investigative items and choices, the analysts did come up with them when they were making their divergent and convergent lists. But most of them, and the number that should be there is about 50%, most of them were in the second half of the list, which is the 50%. So when looking at their choices, looking at all their options, the analysts more often than not chose an item from the bottom of their list, which is the furthest away from their intuition, which means they thought their best items were items that they came up with using their divergent and convergent thinking skills, which is really interesting and is a big difference compared to how I think a lot of us approach our investigations. I'm going to talk about a trait and a situation. We saw one trait that was very common across the analysts. We measured it 79 times, and that trait is low ambiguity tolerance, which is a discomfort with the unknown and unclear meanings. You'd think that we would be really comfortable with this because we deal with it all the time. Ambiguity is just part of the work we do, but no, we don't like it. It's one of the things that really drives us to do the work. One of the things that motivates us to do the work is to reduce that ambiguity in a situation. Speaking of situations, the situations that we encountered were what we termed high-stakes situations. These could be any number of specific instances. One is, let's say you're presented with a type of data that you're not familiar with. Let's say you're presented with a bunch of Mac data and you're used to doing Windows investigations. That would be a high-stakes situation in this context. Maybe you've had a roadblock. Maybe you've run down everything that intuition has had pop into your head and you're stuck and you don't know what to do. So, you get up, you go get your cup of coffee, you take a walk. Another example of one of these high-stakes situations is teamwork. So maybe somebody's going to be looking at the work that you're doing. Maybe you're presenting it to your boss or presenting it to a client. These high-stakes situations create a lot of anxiety for analysts, and that combined with the low ambiguity tolerance is what pushes them out of intuition and into that good divergent and convergent thinking that leads more quickly to better, more high-quality investigative choices. And so this is the model that we've laid out. This is what we saw as a trend in the analysts that we interviewed. Analysts start with intuition. They stay with their intuition until they run into one of these high-stakes situations. They have this trait of low ambiguity tolerance that causes a lot of anxiety in these high-stakes situations, and that pushes them to these divergent and convergent thinking patterns that lead to, like I said, really the good stuff, the best choices, according to the analysts themselves. So how do we do this ourselves? How do we leverage this? Because this is something you can do right now. This is something you already did. So if you want to practice this, because it does take practice to get into this habit and to learn a new way of thinking, maybe you set aside a little bit of time to practice. Maybe you do this as part of a current ongoing investigation. But the first thing you want to do is start with an investigation input, just like the one that I gave you today. And after that, make a list of investigative paths. Again, just like you did today. Sit down, and it's important to actually write this out. This gets your brain working in a different way and lets you tap into those creative processes more easily. So come up with more questions to ask, come up with different types of evidence that you'd like to see. Take a few moments, look at your list, and then pick the best path to start with. Again, this doesn't take very long. We kind of did it here in maybe 3 to 5 minutes. You could take, I would say, no more than 15 at most doing this. This doesn't have to be just by yourself either. This is a wonderful exercise to do with your team. If I was going to give you one suggestion for what to do with this information when you leave here, it would be to do this with your team. Get everybody together, get on a call, go hang out in the conference room, get some coffee. Start with an investigation input. Go through the process of generating questions and evidence paths to pursue and timelines to prove out. Go through that out loud together, and then as a group, pick the best place to start and maybe some other good choices for investigative paths. This is so good. This helps your analysts sharpen their intuition while also becoming less dependent on it. It also gives the junior analysts huge amounts of insight into how the senior analysts are approaching their work. They get to hear it. They get to hear the questions that the more experienced analysts are starting with. I imagine this is sounding kind of familiar to some of y'all. If you are sitting down with your team and talking about investigations and coming up with a list of best questions and best practices, what does that sound like? Playbook. It's a playbook, right? So this is another wonderful exercise to do for playbook development. Take a list of common investigations that you have. Do these exercises with your team. And don't just do one exercise for every kind of input. You might want to come back to common investigations pretty regularly to see if you can come up with better ideas. Over time, you'll develop a list of best practices, and you can have that written down, codified, and available to give to your junior analysts, which is wonderful. I'm not advocating that you make it very strict, because you don't want to hamper the analyst's creativity. You don't want them to feel like they only have one decision path. But it gives them such an advantage. They get to move out of that intuition phase and into that just knowing phase that much more quickly, which is a wonderful thing. So we're kind of getting near the end of our time together, and this is where I would usually open up the floor for questions, but I'm not going to. And I have a good reason. It's not just 'cause. Chris and I wrote a paper. We wrote a 30-page academic-ish paper. I promise there are no double columns. It's very readable. And it lays out everything that we did. It lays out the theory behind our work, how we built our code book, how we structured our interviews, how we developed our model, our cognitive model. I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this, please take a look at the paper, because it will explain it in better detail and more thoroughly than I could even in just a quick conversation. That said, if you do have questions and you have things that you would like to ask, I'm going to be here for the rest of the summit. And Chris, even though he wasn't able to be here, is also very easy to find online. We both are. So please take a look, get our contact info. We would love to talk about this with you. This is something that we are both so enthusiastic about, because this is one of the ways that security investigators, I don't want to say we're at a disadvantage, but a lot of other investigative fields get training in how to think about their process, and it helps them come up to speed more quickly. We don't have that yet. We need to build it. We need to develop it. We need to cultivate it. We need to encourage each other to think about our thinking. This will do things like reduce bias. It'll make our investigations more effective. It will lead to better training and education. It'll reduce new analyst anxiety. Some of that, I'm going to speak from my own experience, sheer terror of staring at the blank search bar and not knowing where to start. There will be some options. There will be resources available. And it won't be on the senior analysts to explain how they just know what they know. I want to thank you all very much for coming out today. I hope you have a good rest of the summit. Again, if you have questions, please come find me. And thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it.